He left home at 21 years old. He had no map, no companion, no plan beyond a single dream. He wanted to reach Mecca before he died. That one wish would keep him walking for the next 29 years. Get comfortable now and listen now. Our story begins in the city of Tangier on the northern coast of Morocco in the year 1325, where a young man said goodbye to everything he had ever known and stepped out into a world that had no edges. Abu Abdullah Muhammad Ibn Battuta was born on the 14th of February, 1304, into a family of scholars and judges. Tangier was his world. Its whitewashed walls, its sea breezes, its minarets catching the morning light, its familiar voices and familiar streets. His family was respected. His future was settled. He would study law as his father had, and his grandfather before that. He would become a qadi, a judge of Islamic law, and he would live a careful, dignified, ordered life in the city where he was born. But something in him could not stay still. He had memorized the Quran by the time he was a young man. He had read the travel accounts of those who had made the great pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj that every Muslim hoped to complete at least once before death. He had read descriptions of Cairo, Alexandria, the holy cities. He had read of deserts wider than anything he could imagine, of rivers that ran backward, of courts where kings sat beneath canopies of silk, of scholars who gathered from every corner of the earth to drink tea and argue about God and mathematics and the nature of time. He had read all of this. And then one morning in June of 1325, at the age of 21, he packed what he could carry on a single mule, said farewell to his parents, and rode out of Tangier. He wrote later that he set off alone, having neither companion in whose company he might find cheer, nor caravan whose company he might join. Just a young man and a mule and a road that led east toward a city he had never seen. He did not know when he left that he would not return for 29 years. He did not know that his parents would die while he was away, and that he would learn of it as a piece of news delivered by a stranger, on a road, in a country whose language he barely spoke. He did not know that he would be robbed, shipwrecked, enslaved briefly, nearly executed, and struck so low by illness that he had to be tied to his horse to keep him from falling. He did not know that he would marry several times, father children he would never raise, and leave behind him a trail of relationships and obligations stretching from Morocco to Mali, to Mali, to Mali, to the Maldive Islands, to China, and back again. He knew none of this. He knew only that the road was there, and that something in him had to follow it. His first great difficulty came quickly. He was crossing North Africa, traveling east along the coast toward Egypt, when his caravan passed through the city of Tunis. He described what happened there in the book that would eventually become his monument, the Rila, the journey. He wrote, "The townspeople came forward on all sides with greetings and questions to one another. But not a soul said a word of greeting to me, since there was none of them that I knew. I felt so sad at heart on account of my loneliness that I could not restrain the tears that started to my eyes, and I wept bitterly. This is the image to hold, not the great explorer in his triumph, not the famous traveler welcomed by kings, but a young man of 21, standing in a crowd of strangers, crying quietly because no one knew his name. He was consoled by a fellow pilgrim, an older man who saw his distress and took him in, introduced him to the educated men of the city, found him lodging at the college of the booksellers. he left Tunis a little less alone, and he would learn over the years and the decades that followed a skill more valuable than navigation or languages or knowledge of law. He would learn how to make a home out of strangers. He reached Alexandria in the spring of 1326 after a journey of more than 3,000 kilometers. He was still, in the deepest sense, a boy from Tangier who had never been anywhere. But Alexandria unmade him. The city was vast and bewildering and magnificent, full of scholars and merchants and sailors and holy men, layered with centuries of civilization, alive with the noise and smell and energy of a place where the whole Mediterranean world converged. In Alexandria, he met a mystic named Burhan al-Din, an old man of tremendous presence who received the young traveler and spoke to him quietly. He told him something that Ibn Battuta would carry for the rest of his life. He said, "I see that you are fond of travel and of visiting distant lands. You must visit my brother Fariduddin in India, and my brother Ruknuddin in Sind, and my brother Burhanuddin in China. Give them my greetings." Ibn Battuta was astonished. India, Sind, China. These were not destinations, they were the edges of the world. But something in the old man's words lodged itself in him like a seed, a direction, a prophecy, a permission to go further than he had imagined. He had dreamed that same night of a great bird that carried him east and then south, and then east again, flying on and on towards something he could not see. The holy man interpreted the dream for him. He said it meant that his travels would take him far to the east, and that he would find great fortune there. Ibn Battuta listened, and he decided in that moment not to go home after Mecca. He decided to keep going. He reached Cairo and was overwhelmed. The city had more than 1 million inhabitants. It was the largest city in the world at that time, a teeming, thunderous, impossible metropolis built on the banks of the Nile, full of colleges and hospitals and gardens and markets and minarets. Ibn Battuta walked its streets and wrote about everything he saw with the careful attention of a man who understood already that he was a witness to things worth remembering. From Cairo he traveled to Palestine and Syria, visiting Jerusalem, where he marveled at the great mosque and the sites of ancient holiness. He stood in Bethlehem. He climbed to Damascus. He moved through a world saturated with history and meaning, a young man whose education had been made of books and who was now reading the world itself, page by living page. He reached Mecca. He completed his first Hajj. He circled the Kaaba with tens of thousands of other pilgrims, swept up in a tide of devotion that was like nothing he had ever experienced. He was, at last, where he had set out to go. He had done what he came to do. He did not go home. He turned east instead and traveled to Iraq and Persia, visiting the ancient cities of Basra and Baghdad and Isfahan, sitting with scholars and saints, arguing theology and jurisprudence in tea houses and courtrooms, always learning, always moving. He returned to Mecca a second time for another Hajj, and then a third time. Mecca became, over those years, a kind of anchor for him, a place he returned to again and again between the long voyages out. He traveled down the coast of East Africa, reaching what is now Kenya and Tanzania, visiting the wealthy and sophisticated Swahili city-states whose existence Europeans would not even learn of for another century. He was astonished by their refinement, their trade, their learning. He traveled to the Arabian Peninsula, to Yemen, to Oman. He crossed the Persian Gulf. He went north through Anatolia, east through the steppe kingdoms of Central Asia, visiting courts and caravanserais and humble guest houses and magnificent mosques. At every stop he was a student. At every stop he was also, increasingly, a man of standing. His education, his bearing, his legal training, his astonishing breadth of experience made him valuable to the rulers and scholars he encountered. He was appointed as a judge more than once, sometimes briefly, sometimes for longer. He served in courts, issued rulings, mediated disputes, performed marriages and divorces. He carried with him, everywhere, the authority of his family and his learning, and he deployed it with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned through years of exposure to every kind of court and every kind of power exactly how to make himself useful. He arrived in India in 1333, 8 years after he had left Tangier, and made his way to Delhi, where he came to the attention of the Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, one of the most powerful and most unpredictable rulers in the world. The Sultan was brilliant, generous, cruel, suspicious, and given to sudden fits of violence that could destroy a man without warning. He took a liking to Ibn Battuta, appointed him as a judge, gave him a salary and a house and gifts, and proceeded to make his life a series of terrifying near misses. Ibn Battuta spent 8 years in India, watching friends and colleagues fall from favor and be executed, navigating the treacherous geography of a court where the Sultan's moods were the weather and everyone lived under the possibility of sudden storm. He wrote later that he witnessed all the glories and setbacks of the Sultan and his rule, fearing daily for his life as he saw many friends fall victim to the suspicious despot. He was careful. He survived. He waited. In 1342, the Sultan appointed him as his ambassador to China. It was a way out, and Ibn Battuta took it. He set off with an enormous retinue, gifts for the Chinese emperor, and the relief of a man escaping a dangerous place for a known destination. But the road to China was not safe. Not far from Delhi, his party was ambushed by bandits. He was captured. The bandits debated whether to kill him. He managed to escape, hiding alone in the Indian countryside, terrified and uncertain, before making his way back to a relative safety. He rejoined a smaller group and continued south. On the Malabar coast of southwestern India, he became caught up in a local war, and then his ship was wrecked in a storm near the city of Calicut. Everything was lost, the gifts for the Chinese emperor, his belongings, his money, the things he had accumulated over years of careful service, gone. He was stranded on the coast of India with nothing. He could not return to Delhi, where the Sultan would almost certainly punish him for losing the imperial gifts. He could not go forward to China without resources. He was, at 50 years old, more alone and more stripped of everything than he had been as a weeping young man in Tunis. He went to the Maldive Islands instead. The Maldives were a chain of low coral islands in the Indian Ocean, isolated and peaceful, ruled by a sultan who needed men of learning and legal training. Ibn Battuta arrived and was appointed as a judge. He threw himself into the work. He reorganized the legal system. He issued rulings. He married. He became, for a time, genuinely settled. He was happy there, in the way that a man who has spent his whole life moving can be happy when he finally stops. But he could not stay. After about 2 years, he quarreled with the local authorities over matters of law and governance, found himself at odds with the people he served, and knew it was time to move on. He had found peace in the Maldives. But peace, for him, was always temporary. The road was always calling. He made his way eventually to China, arriving years later than planned, under entirely different circumstances than intended, without the gifts and the retinue of an imperial ambassador, just a learned man from Morocco, who had been traveling for 2 decades and could not seem to stop. He visited the great cities of China, Guangzhou and Hangzhou and Beijing, and was dazzled and unsettled in equal measure. China was not like any place he had been. The food, the customs, the language, the writing, the sheer density of the civilization overwhelmed him. He felt there more than anywhere like a genuine stranger. He wrote, "China, for all its magnificence, did not please me. I was greatly troubled by the prevalence of non-believers, and whenever I left my lodgings I saw great sorrowing sights that troubled me greatly." This was not prejudice, exactly. It was the honest confession of a man who had spent his entire adult life moving through a world, united by a shared faith and shared language and shared customs, and who had arrived finally at a place where none of those anchors held. He was outside the world he knew. He was, at last, truly foreign. He turned west. Home, eventually, called. He was almost there when he learned that both his parents had died while he was away. He had known, in the abstract, that this was possible. 29 years is a long time. But knowing it abstractly and being told it as news are different things. He was close to Morocco, close to home, close to the city where he had been born, and where he had left as a young man full of simple ambition, and his parents were gone. He had not been there. He could not have been there. He had been in India, in the Maldives, in China, in 100 other places, and he had not been in Tangier where they were dying. He did not return home. Not yet. He went to Al-Andalus instead, to the last Muslim kingdom of Spain, and then south into Africa, to Mali and Timbuktu, the legendary city at the edge of the Sahara, following the road, even now, even at the end, unable to stop. He reached Timbuktu in 1353, nearly 3 decades after he had left home, and was surprised by it. He had expected magnificence and found something more complicated. A great center of learning and trade, yes, but also a place with its own customs that baffled him, its own rules that he did not always understand. He argued with the locals. He was impatient. He was by then an old man by the standards of his time, exhausted and sometimes difficult, carrying the weight of a life spent permanently in motion. He returned to Morocco in 1354, 29 years, 75,000 miles, 44 countries in their modern equivalents, 3 continents, more than 2,000 individuals named in his account, from sultans to scholars to simple guest masters who gave him a meal and a bed when he had nothing. The Sultan of Morocco heard of his arrival and summoned him. He commanded Ibn Battuta to sit with a young scholar named Ibn Juzay and dictate the account of his travels. For 2 years the old traveler sat and talked, and the young scholar wrote, and between them they created the book known as the Rila, the Journey, a gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of traveling. Ibn Battuta died around 1368 or 1369 in Morocco, the country of his birth. He is buried in Tangier. The Rihla was largely forgotten for centuries. European scholars began to take it seriously in the 19th century, when it was translated into English in 1829. Scholars who read it carefully found it astonishing, not only for the breadth of its travels, but for the quality of its observation, its honesty about failure and fear and loneliness, its willingness to describe not just the wonders of the world, but the difficulties of moving through it as a human being. He got things wrong sometimes. He misremembered. He embellished. He was a man telling a long story from memory, and memory is not a perfect instrument. But the essential truth of what he witnessed, the immense, complicated, dazzling world of the 14th century as seen by one restless man who could not stop walking through it, that is real. That is preserved. That endures. There is a statue of him now in Tangier. In Dubai, there is a shopping mall named for him. In his hometown of Yaoundé in Morocco, though he was born in Tangier, there is a monument. His name is given to streets and schools and institutions in countries he visited by descendants of people he never met, in a world that has changed beyond anything he could have imagined. And somewhere in the libraries of the world, in dozens of translations, the Rihla sits on shelves, waiting for the next reader who will open it and find, on the first pages, a young man of 21 riding out of a familiar city on a single mule into a world without edges, alone and afraid and completely, irrevocably alive. And so ends the tale of Ibn Battuta, a man who left home to reach one city and spent 29 years discovering the whole world instead. You know what this old story teaches us? That the road we plan is almost never the road we walk. That the greatest journeys begin with a single step taken in loneliness and faith, not certainty. That the world is larger and stranger and more full of kindness than any of us dare imagine until we step outside our door and discover it for ourselves. Now, close your eyes and imagine a young man on a dusty road at dawn, riding east out of a white city by the sea, not yet knowing how far he will go, or what he will lose, or what he will find, only knowing that the road is there, and that it is time to walk it. Good night.